So the U of A did a study about how we use our voice, how many words we use per day. They found that on average, women speak 16,215 words per day. On the other hand, men speak 15,669 words per day. So not a really big difference there. But they also found one person that only spoke an estimated 795 words per day. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to say at least 2,000 words in the next 15 minutes. But then they also found one person who used 47,000 words per day. Interesting fact, both of those participants that were the least and most talkative person were men. So next time someone tries to tell you women speak more than men, please refer them to this study. So on average, we use our voice a ton, right? We speak thousands of words a day. And we're going to look at this really simple idea of how we use our voice. But here's the thing, we're not going to look at this idea of how many times we speak certain words a day, like the quantity of how we use our voice, but we're going to look at the other side of how, meaning the influence of how we use our voice, how we choose to speak, the significance of when we choose to speak. So if you have a Bible, go ahead, open it up to the book of Esther. We're going to look at her story today. And as you're flipping open to the book of Esther, I'm going to give you kind of a summary of what has been going on. We're going to look at four main characters in the book of Esther. So first, we have Esther, as you might have predicted, and she's like the main character that we're going to look at. Esther, and then she has this relative named Mordecai, and I say relative because some people think that it's her uncle, some people say cousin, but all we know is that Mordecai adopted Esther at a young age, and so we've got Esther and Mordecai, and they're like kind of the good guys in the story, and then on the other side, I'm like not 100% saying they're the bad guys, but they're like not the good guys. We have King Xerxes, who is the king. And then we have Haman, who is like his right-hand man. So imagine like King Xerxes is the president, and then the vice president is Haman. He's like the second most powerful person in our story in the government. So like I said, we've got Esther, and she is a Jewish girl living in Persia, which is modern-day Iran. And she was living there during the exile, meaning that like most of the Jewish people were no longer living in Israel, and they were living outside of Israel. And she lived with a group in Persia. And then we have King Xerxes, like I said. So King Xerxes, this is like kind of how I imagine him as a like human being, right? He decided to throw a huge banquet, and he invited all of the other royals in Persia, all the other like influential leaders. And he was like, look at my beautiful palace. Look at all the money I have. Look at how wealthy I am and how rich I am. And he served all of this like eloquent food. And then King Xerxes was like, let me bring out my beautiful and gorgeous wife. Well, here's the thing. His wife didn't want to come out because she was like, that's lame. I'm not going to do that. And so then King Xerxes decided to get rid of his wife. That's what the Bible tells us. He disposed of his wife. Like, I don't think she died, but basically they just decided like she's no longer queen. Okay? So then King Xerxes, again, this man, decides that he's going to basically do what I would consider like the modern day bachelor. He decides to bring all of the women in his country to the palace. And for like a year, he's going to date them and decide who he's going to marry and who's going to be the next queen. Well, guess what? We're going to fast forward a little bit in our story. King Xerxes picks Esther to be the next queen. So, like I said, there was this man Haman, and he was the second in command to King Xerxes. We've got Queen Esther, she's the new queen. We've got King Xerxes, and then we've got Haman. He's the second most powerful man in Persia. But here's the thing about Haman. Like I said, he's kind of the bad guy in this story. Haman was pretty dang prejudiced against the Jews. Like, he did not like the fact that, I said earlier, Esther's relative Mordecai wouldn't bow down before him. He didn't like the fact that these Jews were dedicated to God. They believed God was their only authority. So they didn't see Haman as this big, powerful person like he wanted to be seen. And like most times when prejudice occurs, it grew from a place of pride where Haman believed he was better than the other people. Prejudice often then grows into hatred. So what happens when one lives in a place of hatred? Let's start reading here. Chapter 3, verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the province of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. Let's go destroy these people because they're different than us, because they have different customs, they have a different God, they have a different law. Because they're different, let's destroy them. Prejudice is defined by unreasonable feelings, opinions, or attitudes, especially of a hostile nature, regarding an ethnic, racial, social, or religious group. It's unreasonable to want to destroy someone because they are different. Haman was extremely prejudiced against the Jewish people because they are different. And who's included in them, those people that are different? Esther, their queen. You see, when Esther was a Jewish girl living in Persia during the exile, she becomes queen eventually, right? But when Esther became queen, she didn't share with anyone that she wasn't originally from Persia. She didn't share with anyone that information. She didn't tell anyone she was Jewish. She kept that information private. But when Esther finds out that these other people, her people, are going to be destroyed, she knows she needs to do something. She's scared. She doesn't want to speak up because in this culture especially, if a woman were to come forward and speak in the king's court, she could be killed. I mean, we saw what happened to the other queen when she wouldn't come forward just to be looked at, not even to speak. So Queen Esther was scared. So Esther sends her relative Mordecai a letter, and she says she doesn't think she can do anything to stop this. She doesn't think she can speak up. She doesn't think she can do anything to help prevent the destruction of the Jewish people that is soon to come. Verse 13 tells us Mordecai sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So Esther had two options. She could remain silent or arise. The cost is so high to speak up and arise and share with us what might happen. She might lose her friends if she speaks up. She might lose power and influence. She might even lose her life. To remain silent is easier. And maybe you can relate to Esther on that. We often might feel like we're placed in similar situations, that if I speak up, if I use my voice in a time like this, in this moment, it might cost too much. It's easier to be silent than say something when someone is being bullied at school. It's easier to say nothing and be silent on social media when someone is posting and saying hurtful things about another person. It's easier to be silent when you're sitting at the dinner table and someone in your family says racist or homophobic or sexist thoughts about other people. It's easier for us to just be silent than to speak up. We can relate to Esther. It's easier to be silent than to use our voice. We have to count the cost of what it means to use our voice, because let's not pretend that using our voice is the easy way. But doing what is right is not often easy. The story continues and says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther plans and prepares, and she goes boldly forward, knowing that she might lose her life. Sometimes it might be right to go against the law, to stand for what is right. Eventually, through a number of different circumstances, and specifically though Esther's boldness when she goes before the king and speaks up for what is wrong, she speaks up against the destruction of her people. The king hears their cries, realizes this is unjust. He remembers how the Jewish people in the past, specifically Esther's relative Mordecai, have helped the kingdom in the past, and he puts things right. He realizes what's wrong. The king realizes the wickedness in Haman, and he eventually even puts Haman to death. And they all live happily ever after. See, I told you guys it was like The Bachelor. That's exactly what happens. Live happily ever after. But unlike The Bachelor, there's a lot of really great things that we can take from this story. There's some really great application we can take away. First, we must confront our own prejudice and biases. Yes, we must confront our own prejudice and biases. Esther's story would have been completely different if Haman was aware of the fact that he had this prejudice, he had these biases against the Jewish people. He allowed for his heart to fester and grow into hatred for how he felt. He allowed for his pride to consume him and rule over any moments of humility he might have once had. Here's the thing, no person is completely evil or completely good, like except for Jesus. He was all good. But no person, like none of us are completely good or completely evil. We battle this like internal conflict within ourselves, right? Paul, who was one of the writers in the New Testament, actually wrote about this in a letter to Rome. It's in chapter 7. He says, although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. We have this desire to do good. Most of us are like not maliciously evil, right? But the evil that we see, it's so tempting. It looks so fun. We want to do it. And it takes over instead of the good inside of us. It doesn't look horrible. It doesn't look as bad as what it is. So we're torn between wanting good, like we want to be good people, right? But the evil is more appealing and it's more tempting for us and we want it. But here's the thing. Paul also writes that we don't need to be stuck into this battle of temptation between good and evil. He says, what a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ, our Lord. We do not need to live as slaves to sin and temptation anymore because we have been freed from that by our faith in Jesus Christ. What that means is we need to do the hard work in our hearts to figure out where sin has taken root. Any prejudice, judgment, harsh criticism we have of someone, it's not just evil, it's not just wrong, it's sin. And when we don't confront it, this sin bleeds into hatred. And honestly, as Christians, the only thing that we should hate is sin itself. So something that we need to do is we need to take time to process and figure out where that sin is rooted in our heart. Sit down and ask yourself sometime this week, take 5 minutes and ask, who are people that I instinctively just dislike? There's something about it, I just dislike them. What is it about them that makes me feel this way? Who are people that I constantly talk about, I gossip about, I say bad things about? What do I say in anger about others? If you can make some connections between these situations, you might be able to identify where some prejudice has grown in your heart, how you need to confront these things and lean into a soft and humble heart that reflects Jesus. We must confront our own prejudice and biases. Secondly, we need to understand that God is in control, yet Esther still had to act. Those two truths do not contradict one another. God chooses to work through those who are willing to act. We pray with boldness, but everything depends on God. But we act with confidence that what we're doing is done for the righteousness with God. Too often, I fear as Christians, we fall into like these two extremes on this. Either we do everything and we act all the time and we're constantly like, I'm doing this in faith for Jesus. Or instead, what ends up happening is we sit into this area of silence where we're just saying, hey, I trust Jesus. I trust that Jesus is going to make this better. I trust Jesus, but we don't do anything about it. And then people look at the church today in 2020 and they say, why is the church so silent? Why is the church doing nothing yet saying they trust in this man, Jesus? We look so silly when we say, if I trust Jesus and he's in control, then he will stop the fact that there are 45 million people today in 2020 in modern day slavery. I don't need to do anything. I'm praying about it. I'm trusting Jesus. If I trust Jesus and I say he's in control, then he will just help the fact that 780 million people do not have access to an improved water source, or the estimated 2.5 billion people who lack access to improved sanitation. I don't need to do anything about these injustices. I'm praying about it. I trust Jesus. If I trust Jesus and I say he is in control, then he, Jesus, will help the fact that thousands of men and women sit on death row. I don't need to do anything, despite the fact that as Christians, we know Jesus himself told us it's no longer about an eye for an eye, but it's about turning the other cheek. I need to trust Jesus, so I don't need to act for these injustices. But I am not living like Jesus if I refuse to act in the face of injustice. I might be trusting in Jesus, but I am not living like him if I refuse to act in the face of injustice. We need to understand God is in control, but we are still called to act. There's a reason why James, a brother of Jesus, wrote in a letter to the early church that we need to have faith and actions working together because our faith is made complete by our actions. We trust God. We know he's in control, and we act. We move forward with boldness for what is right. We can all do this. We can all act. We can all follow in Esther's example. The final thing that we can take away from this story is that we need to, third, use your voice, perhaps for such a time as this. Esther did not want to speak up. She did not want to use her voice. There was a cost to do this, and that cost could have been and should have been her life. But she believed that sometimes it is worth risking it all to seek justice for those that are hurting. It takes bold and courageous faith to be Esther's in this world. We must be willing to risk it out, to speak up, to use our own voice. And this might make you uncomfortable right now, but I believe that we as the Christian evangelical church in this world need to speak up about some things going on. We need to use our voice about some injustices that are happening today in this world. And one of those things that I believe we need to say is that Black lives matter. When we say this, we're not saying that other lives don't matter. That is not what we're saying. What we're saying is that there is a system in place in the United States that for 400 years has disproportionately worked against people of a minority race. When we say Black lives matter, what we're saying is we need to see these parts of our system changed. And hear me, CSM, when I'm saying this, I'm not saying this to you with some political agenda that I have. I'm saying this to you because I believe that this is right. When I was in college, I was president of College Republicans. I sat on the state board for College Republicans. I interned with a Republican congresswoman. When I say this to you, this is not political. It's biblical. That is why I believe this. It's what Jesus, I believe, would say if he was standing here in 2020, because it's what he said to the Samaritan woman at the well when he said to her that she mattered. It didn't matter about her ethnicity or her sin. Her life mattered to him. It's how Jesus would use his voice, I believe, in 2020 when he said through Paul that it doesn't matter anymore if you are a Gentile or Jew, Black or white, you are all equal and one in the kingdom of heaven. I believe this is how Jesus would act in 2020 because he taught us to leave the 99 and go after the one that is lost and hurting and advocate for them. It's not saying that the 99 no longer matter or are not important. It's saying that there's one right now that is hurting and we need to step in and be worried about that. I believe that perhaps it is such a time as this for you to use your voice to get uncomfortable with some things right now, but to step forward and act. Jesus calls us to love beyond what we feel is comfortable so that we can reflect him in our culture every single day. And it might be time for some of you to get a bit uncomfortable and use your voice, to step up, to act. You have a choice like Esther to remain silent about injustices that are happening in our world every single day, or to choose to be like Esther, despite the fact there's fear and they're scared and that there will things that could be lost in this moment, but to use your voice for what is right. To love someone, you need to advocate for them. To advocate for things in this world that could be made better. We advocate for justice to best reflect Jesus in our life. God is in control, but it's time for us to act. It's time for us to use our voice and act. Thanks, CSM.